What were you doing in 1987? Because that was also the year that the last Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mission or reserve was closed in Queensland. Not that long ago, huh? Rose Barrowcliffe is a Bachelor woman and the First Nations advisor at the Queensland State Archives. Good morning, Rose.
Good morning, Sarah.
So can you tell me why these missions were established in the first place?
Well, the missions were established by various religious groups around Queensland, and I think in a lot of cases it was just an individual preacher or someone from a church group who took it upon themselves as part of their life calling to do that. So it was quite informal, let's say. But then it became very systematic with the introduction of the Aboriginals Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act in 1897, and that changed the whole landscape of missions and reserves.
So do we know how widespread the missions and reserves were in Queensland?
You know, the hardest part about understanding how widespread they are is that there's little bits of information everywhere. There were missions and reserves all over Queensland. Some of them, as I've already said, were quite informal and may not have been registered as an official mission. And then you have some that were administered by the Queensland government, which we have a lot more information on. But suffice it to say that there were missions all the way across the state. So all the way from Ipswich, going all the way up to the tip of the Cape and into the Torres Strait, and then a lot of the islands as well. So Gari, my traditional country, had several different missions at different times, and a lot of the islands were seen as good places to have missions because they were really isolated and they could control the movement on and off the islands. And then, of course, there was missions in central and outback Queensland as well. I think for me, one of the funniest things is that, you know, we know about the missions that are there and that have probably turned into townships like Cherbourg or Wujal. And, you know, they just closed as a reserve in 1987. So I think when people think about missions, they also think about them from a long, long time ago. But 1987 was only 36 years ago. But the other thing is that there's a lot of land that was earmarked for reserves that may not have turned into reserves. And my favourite one to think about is Noosa Heads, which, as we know, is probably the most sought after real estate in Queensland these days. And I just kind of think, wow, imagine if that had been gazetted as an Aboriginal reserve and we have the best surf and the best beaches just all tied up. But they definitely have a history of, once they realised there was a resource on that country that they might have earmarked as a reserve, it very quickly was ungazetted or, you know, allocated to a different resource. It was usually only the land that no one wanted that they would create a reserve from.
And some of them, I guess, kept going, but others, like the Mackay Reserve, were abandoned, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and a lot of that depended on who was running it and the amount of funds that were available for it. A lot of people will probably know the big ones and have heard of the big ones. So in the southeast Queensland region, Cherbourg is probably a place that most people have heard of. And that was previously called the Baramba Mission and then renamed Cherbourg. And that was kind of a huge catch-all mission or reserve that even when other reserves shut down, so like Doronda, which was up at Woodford, and Deebing Creek, which was at Ipswich, when they shut down, they actually just moved their inmates, and that's literally what they called the Aboriginal people that were being held in these reserves. They were called inmates. They moved them to Cherbourg. So Cherbourg just got bigger and bigger. It wasn't until the deed of grant and trust possibility came about through the Community Services Act in 1984 that it actually stopped being run as a reserve. It became an independent community where the local community had their own administration over that town. So a lot of the larger reserves have had that happen where they've got the deed of grant and trust in place where it's now administered as an Aboriginal township or a Torres Strait Islander township. It's very common in the Torres Straits as well.
On ABC Radio, Rose Barrowcliffe is joining you, looking at the history of the missions and reserves across Queensland. And Rose, I've heard the words local protectors thrown around. Who were the local protectors and what did they do?
Yeah, so with the Act, as it's commonly referred to, there was a number of people who were appointed to then oversee the lives or the administration of these reserves, but then there were also local protectors to administer the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the most immediate responsibilities were controlling movements on and off these reserves and missions, but also controlling the wages. So the wages would come into a central pool, or they would come in, and the local administrator would be able to decide how much of those wages were actually paid to the person who was working and earning that money. They also decided movement on and off the reserves. So, for example, Auntie Ruth Hegarty wrote about her experience of growing up and living on Cherbourg and how she was to work as a domestic helper in a house in Jandowae and had a really tough time there, and petitioned for the local protector to let her go back to Cherbourg. And he decided, no, even though your mistress is being really terrible to you and calling you horrible names all the time, it's in your best interest to stay there, and it's probably for your own good, and you've probably brought that on yourself anyway. So really micro-controlling the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, also deciding who they could marry, if they could marry. Every detail of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives often came under the control of these protectors.
And let's be honest, the history of Indigenous people in our country being looked after is not great. How closely were these local protectors held to account for their actions?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say they really weren't, or I guess it was very paternalistic, this idea of protection, and also very racist, this thought that Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people could not be responsible for their own lives. But also, in some cases, the people who were running these missions and reserves were quite sketchy characters themselves. So if you look at Reverend Edward Fuller, for example, he started up a mission on Gari, on my homeland, and that failed. And then he just kept moving on to other missions that failed and was never held to account for that. They just kept moving him to different locations. So he was the first administrator for the Deebing Creek mission. After that, he went from Gari to around Lake Wyber. There was a mission there that failed. Then he moved to Deebing Creek in Ipswich. That failed. Then he went up north and administered missions on Hinchinbrook and Bellenden Plains. They both failed. So there was no thought that maybe the problem was him. It was just, I think always that, the problem was the Aboriginal people and they're too problematic, and that's why this solution that we've come up with is not working, never thinking that the solution was terrible.
These missions and reserves, what impact did they have on local communities and family groups?
Huge. I don't think it can be overstated how detrimental it was to the families and communities in these missions. I think one of the biggest things is that there was a lot of movement between the missions. So that could have been, for example, if the mission failed, so as I've already said with Deebing Creek, or even the mission at Bagimba on Gari, when that failed, the people who were there, who were originally moved into that mission from the local area, so they had some form of connection or close, they were relatively connected to that area. But when those missions failed, they just moved them to another mission. And so like Deebing Creek being forcibly moved from Ipswich to Cherbourg, or just outside of Mergen, or being moved from Gari up to Yarrabah, and they had no connection with that country. So you've got people who've just been ripped off their country and moved to somewhere completely new. They've had no say in it. And sometimes that meant they were being separated from their families as well in many cases. So that was obviously on a large scale. But then also, if you were seen to be a troublemaker on these missions or reserves, they could easily, and often did, move people to a different reserve just as a form of punishment, because they knew they would be removing them from their family and support groups when they did that. So it completely disrupted family groups and communities, and also in many ways connection to country, to be moved on to the traditional country of some other group that you had no knowledge of or no connection to, is obviously a very big deal for Indigenous people.
And trying to reconnect with country and family histories, it makes that quite challenging as the years go on too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's why oral histories have been so important for so many people, because they didn't have the ability to keep track necessarily, or the records that were created at the time about all what the protectors' decisions about moving people and where they were going to move to. Our ancestors didn't have access to any of those records. They didn't even know they were being created. But you could, keep contact. You would go to a new place, and then I know, for example, with my mother, who is Stolen Generations, the aunties had this sort of like the aunties network where they all share, oh, so and so showed up in this place and so is here now, and trying to always keep word of mouth going, or through the Murray grapevine, keep track of where people had ended up as best they could.
There is so much more to dig into when it comes to the history of missions and reserves, but it is worth remembering that, there were a lot more than probably a lot of us know across Queensland, and it's really great to be able to dig through the archives like this with you, Rose, and, get a little bit of an insight to a part of our history that we don't talk all that much about. Galangor Yin, Rose, really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Sarah.
Rose Barrowcliffe there, a Bachelor woman and the First Nations advisor at the Queensland State Archives.